The cell block was silent, too silent for a Federal Supermax. Thick concrete walls held in the sound like a drum. The lights above buzzed faintly, flickering as if they were nervous. And in the center of the long, cold hallway stood a group of federal officers in dark uniforms, each one tense and holding a sealed folder marked confidential. At the far end of the hall, behind a solid steel door thicker than a car, sat one man the government had spent decades watching. Larry Hoover. He wasn't moving. He wasn't speaking. He wasn't even standing. He simply sat at his metal desk inside his ADX Florence Supermax cell, head lowered, hands folded, like someone waiting for a storm he already knew was coming. But the storm was already here. Outside his cell, officers exchanged nervous looks. Reports said Hoover, who had been in solitary confinement for years, was still somehow managing to influence people far beyond the prison walls. His voice was still traveling. His messages were still spreading. Somehow, from inside the most secure prison in America, Hoover was still leading. One of the officers swallowed hard as the warden approached. The warden's face was serious, tired, and pale. He held a new document, stamped with federal markings and time-sensitive seals. "We have proof," he said quietly to the officers. "He's still directing operations. From inside this place." The officers stared at the cell door like it held a monster behind it. A monster they could see but never fully stop. "Open it," the warden said. The steel door slid back with a deep mechanical rumble, revealing Hoover sitting calmly in the dim light. His eyes lifted at the exact moment the door stopped. He didn't blink. He didn't flinch. He simply stared at the men in front of him with a calm that made them uneasy. The warden stepped forward. "Mr. Hoover," he said, voice steady but tight, "we need to talk about how you're still communicating with the outside world." Hoover smiled, slowly, quietly, like someone who knew a secret no one else could understand. "I'm right here," he said softly. "That's all it takes." The officers tensed. One of the radios clipped to a guard's vest suddenly hissed, screeched, then cut to static. Another flickered off. The hallway lights flashed. Something was wrong. Something inside the prison system was glitching, right in front of Hoover. The warden looked at the officers. "Shut it down," he ordered. "Full block lockdown. Now." But before anyone could move, something even stranger happened. Every light on the block went completely dark. Total blackout. Not one bulb, not one emergency lamp stayed on. And in the dark, Hoover whispered a single sentence. "You can't cage an idea." His voice echoed through the blackness. Footsteps. Radios failing. Officers yelling into the void. Then, from deeper inside the block, someone knocked 3 times on a steel door, loud, slow, deliberate. Bang. 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 A signal. A message. A warning. And that is the moment the world learned that Larry Hoover, even inside the highest security prison in America, was not done. Not even close. The blackout ended as fast as it came. Lights snapped back on. Hoover sat perfectly still, as though nothing had happened. The warden stared at him, shaken. What did you just do?" Hoover didn't answer. He only smiled again. The chapter freezes there, with the warden standing inches away from a man whose power seemed to reach further than any wall, any gate, any lock. To understand how Hoover reached this point, why the government believed he still ran a nationwide enterprise from inside prison, we must go back. We must see where it all began. Long before the Supermax cell, long before the secret messages, long before the blackout. Larry Hoover was a young man from Chicago. He grew up in tough neighborhoods where life felt like a fast race with dangerous roads. Many kids in his community struggled. Some fell into trouble early. Some tried to stay away from bad influences. Hoover was sharp, observant, and had a natural leader's presence even as a teenager. People listened when he spoke. In the late 1960s, Chicago was full of gangs shaped by poverty, lack of chances, and unsafe streets. Many young people joined groups hoping for protection or belonging. Hoover was one of them. The Gangster Disciples began as a small group of young men trying to survive, but Hoover's influence slowly pushed the group into something bigger, something structured. He taught rules. He taught order. He taught strategy. The group grew because people wanted direction, and Hoover gave it. As time passed, the Gangster Disciples became one of the most organized street groups in Chicago. But organization can be used for harm or for good. The government believed Hoover used it for harm, saying the group became tied to serious crimes across neighborhoods. Hoover was arrested for murder as a young man and given a long prison sentence. Many thought that would end his influence. But it didn't. Inside state prison, Hoover's leadership didn't weaken, it expanded. He brought structure where there was chaos. He created a system inmates followed. The Gangster Disciples grew in numbers and made rules not just in Chicago, but in prisons across several states. Hoover's name traveled through letters, phone calls, visitors, and whispers. Some people claimed he helped reduce certain conflicts between inmates by giving them a system to follow. Others claimed he used that power to grow illegal activity. The truth was complicated. In prison, power can be used in many ways. And Hoover had plenty of it. Years passed. Hoover continued to rise inside the prison system, controlling influence through coded messages. Federal agents became worried. They believed Hoover was directing orders for a nationwide enterprise from behind bars. They spent years watching, listening, tracking calls, and following money. In the 1990s, the federal government launched a major operation to target Hoover's network. They recorded Hoover's visitors. They recorded phone calls. They made a huge case against him. When agents finally arrested multiple people tied to the investigation, they included Hoover in the federal charges. He was moved from state prison to federal court. Hoover stood in a courtroom with serious charges against him. The judge listened to tapes. Prosecutors made claims. Hoover's lawyers argued back. But the result was clear. Hoover was given multiple life sentences in federal prison. Then came the next moment that changed everything. He was sent to ADX Florence, the toughest prison in America. A place built to keep the most dangerous inmates cut off from the world. A place with steel, concrete, silence, and walls so thick that a shout could never reach another cell. Cells that are small and cold. Inmates spend most of their time alone. Contact is limited. Movement is controlled. Many inmates in ADX are isolated almost entirely. The government believed they had finally stopped Hoover's reach. But then strange things began to happen. Messages appeared in places Hoover had never been. Calls were made from areas he could not access. Orders seemed to travel without a voice. And people across the country whispered that Hoover's influence continued, not because he broke out of prison, but because he had built something so big that it lived on without him. The government didn't like that idea. So now, back in the Supermax cell block, after the blackout, after the knock on the steel door, after Hoover whispered his message, the warden took a slow breath. "We are tightening everything," the warden said. "Every call, every visitor, every piece of paper. You will not reach outside again." Hoover stared at him. "You're too late," he said. "It already moved." The warden stepped back. "What moved?" Hoover slowly leaned forward. "You'll see." Before the warden could respond, a loud, urgent pounding echoed from the far end of the block. Bang 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 bang. A guard sprinted into view, out of breath and wide-eyed. "Warden," he shouted. "What is it?" "It's the control room," the guard said. "Someone triggered." He stopped, gulping air. "The entire door system." The warden's face drained of color. "What do you mean?" The guard pointed toward the main corridor. "Something is unlocking." The officers turned in fear toward the hallway. And Hoover simply closed his eyes, as if he knew this moment was coming. The chapter ends right there, with a full cell block of officers staring at a hallway where the locks are beginning to click open. The clicking didn't stop. One lock. Then another. Then another. The sound echoed down the concrete hallway like dominoes falling in slow motion. Click, 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 click. The officers froze, staring into the long corridor where the doors were sealed just moments before. In ADX Florence, the most secure federal prison in the country, doors never opened by themselves. Every gate needed a guard's key, a digital code, and a second approval from the control room. But now they were unlocking in a chain reaction. The warden stepped forward carefully and whispered, "Who triggered the system?" The guard who had just run in shook his head, sweating. "Sir, we don't know. The control room is offline. The cameras are black. The backup panel won't respond." Another lock clicked open. Hoover sat still inside his cell, too still. His eyes didn't blink. His breathing didn't change. He watched the officers panic, but he didn't look surprised. It was as if he expected every second of this. "Pull him out of the cell," the warden ordered. "Now." Two officers stepped into Hoover's cell, hands ready to restrain him. But as they reached for him, the hallway lights dimmed again to half power. A faint hum came through the air vents, like a power surge rolling through the building. Then the prison's PA system crackled alive. At first it was static, soft, distant. Then a voice. Not Hoover's. Not a guard's. Not a recording. A deep voice speaking three slow words. We still move. The officers looked at Hoover immediately. But Hoover just tilted his head and said quietly, "Told you." Panic rippled through the hallway. The PA system shut off again. The officers dragged Hoover out of his cell, but the warden stopped them. "No," he said. "Leave him. We're investigating the panel first." "But sir." I said leave him. They backed away, leaving Hoover inside, still calm, still eerily quiet, like he was watching a TV show he had seen before. Another set of locks clicked again. The warden turned to the guards. "We're moving to the control room. Let's go. Stay together." He pointed at one officer. "You, stay here with Hoover. Do not leave him alone." The officers moved fast down the hallway, boots pounding, radios useless, lights flickering overhead. But as soon as the warden and the team turned the corner, the officer left behind felt a wave of silence wash over the block. It was too quiet, the kind of quiet you feel inside your bones. "Don't try anything," the officer warned Hoover. His voice cracked. Hoover didn't answer. The officer paced back and forth, staring at the cell and then at the corner where the others had disappeared. Every few seconds he wiped sweat from his forehead. Then he froze. Because from farther down the long hallway, he heard footsteps. One pair. Slow. Deliberate. Almost like someone was pacing the hallway openly and confidently. But no one was supposed to be out. The footsteps kept coming. The officer lifted his flashlight and aimed it toward the sound. "Who's there?" he yelled. No answer. He aimed the beam down the hallway, and saw a figure standing at the far end. He couldn't see the face. Just a shadow. Still. Silent. "Identify yourself," he shouted again. Nothing. Then the figure took one step forward. The officer stepped back nervously. He grabbed his radio, still dead. No signal, no sound. The figure began walking toward him slowly. The officer raised his voice again. "Stop. Don't come any closer." The figure didn't stop. It kept coming. The officer panicked. He glanced at Hoover's cell. Hoover wasn't even watching the figure. Hoover was watching him, the officer, like he was waiting for his reaction. The officer shouted again. "Stop. I'm serious." The figure stepped into the edge of the flashlight beam. And the officer almost dropped the light. Because the man coming toward him was another inmate. An inmate who was supposed to be locked behind a steel door 20 cells away. How are you out?" the officer stuttered. The inmate said nothing. He just kept walking until he was standing at the edge of the light, hands at his sides, eyes cold. "Get back," the officer yelled, his voice cracking. The inmate didn't move. Not forward. Not backward. Just stared with calm, quiet confidence. Like Hoover. The officer swallowed hard and tightened his grip on the flashlight. He thought about running. He thought about calling for help again, even though the radio was dead. Then Hoover finally spoke. "You hear that?" he asked softly. The officer turned toward Hoover. "Hear what?" Hoover raised his eyes slowly. "The other ones." The officer froze. Because suddenly he heard it too, more footsteps. Multiple pairs. Coming from different corners of the block. Slow. Soft. Coordinated. The officer's heart nearly stopped. He pointed his flashlight wildly, trying to see them all at once. "Who's out there?" But no one answered. Then, from the PA system again came another message, this time whispered, grainy, but unmistakably deliberate. "The structure stands." The officer whipped his head toward Hoover. "What does that mean?" Hoover only blinked. Before the officer could yell again, another loud metallic sound filled the block. Thunk. A gate had just shut somewhere down the hall. Locked. Then another. The officer realized something terrifying. The doors weren't opening anymore. They were closing. Closing him in. Closing the hallway. Closing the exits. He spun toward Hoover's cell. Hoover sat calmly. "You need to run," Hoover said quietly. "Run? Where?" the officer shouted. But Hoover didn't answer. The lights flickered again. Then they went out completely. Total darkness swallowed the hallway. The officer dropped his flashlight. It rolled across the concrete floor, spinning, the beam shaking wildly before settling against a wall. In its last faint circle of light, the officer saw the inmate shadow stepping closer. And then, the flashlight died. The officer screamed. And the lights flashed back on. The warden stood at the far end of the hallway, breathing hard, his team behind him. "Officer," he shouted. "What happened?" But the officer couldn't answer. He stood frozen, pale, shaking. He pointed down the hallway. He was here. They were loose. I saw him. He was walking right toward me. The warden looked up and down the hallway. Every cell door was closed. Every inmate was inside. The hallway was empty. The warden's face hardened. You're exhausted, he said. Hallucinating under stress. No one is out. The officer stepped backward. I'm telling you, someone was out. But Hoover, still sitting in his cell, spoke. He wasn't hallucinating. The officer felt chills race down his spine. The warden stared at Hoover. What is happening? He demanded. How are doors opening? Who's using the PA? How? Hoover looked at him calmly. You keep thinking this is about doors, he said softly. But it's about people. The warden shook his head. You're cut off. You're in solitary. You have no contact with anyone. Hoover raised an eyebrow. Don't I? Before the warden could answer, another guard came running full speed around the corner. Warden, he gasped. We have a situation. The warden snapped. What now? The guard held out a trembling hand. A message just came through the outside intel line. It's from Chicago. It's urgent. The warden snatched the paper. His eyes scanned it, and widened in shock. No, that's impossible, he whispered. Hoover watched him, silent and patient. The warden's hands shook. He looked at Hoover. How could this happen? He asked. Hoover finally stood up inside his cell, slow, steady, as though everything was moving according to a plan only he understood. He stepped toward the bars. And softly said, It already has. The warden stumbled backward. What did you do? Hoover smiled faintly. This isn't about me. The lights dimmed again. The PA crackled again. This time, a single unmistakable word echoed through the entire Supermax block. Activate. Every officer froze. Every alarm light turned red. A steel gate at the far end of the hallway began to rise. And the chapter ends right there, with the massive gate lifting. And every officer staring in horror. As something, or someone, begins to appear beneath it.